Welcome everyone to day 3 of COPRH. We're really glad to see so many of you returning. I am pleased to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Andrea Troxel, who is the Director of Biostatistics and Professor of Population Health at NYU. She has extensive experience in the design, implementation, and analysis of clinical trials of all phases, including both pragmatic and adaptive randomized trials. She collaborates with investigators in a wide range of clinical areas, including oncology, cardiology, chronic disease, and behavioral economics. She's also heavily involved in educational activities in biostatistics and clinical trials, including this one. So thank you so much. We're really excited to hear you talk about implementing pragmatic trials via electronic platforms, both the practical and the ethical considerations around consent, participation, analysis of these sorts of trials. I think this is quite relevant in a direction that we're expecting to go in more and more. And we right now are looking at your folder rather than
Oh dear,
slides.
sorry, wrong screen. Thank you. Let me try that again. All right. Is that better?
Yes, there we go.
Okay.
So thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'm really pleased to have been invited to join in this really important conference. The agenda has been rich and full and really wonderful, so I'm very pleased to be a part of it. And as Bethany mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about pragmatic trials, and in particular, how we can leverage electronic platforms to address some of the challenges with pragmatic trials. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I understand a pragmatic trial to be. I know that this has probably already been a topic of some conversation in this year's conference as well as in years past, but just to get us all kind of on the same page, I will provide a little bit of a definition of a working definition of how I view pragmatic trials. I'll give some examples of the ways in which digital platforms can be used to both facilitate and implement some of these trials. And then I'll talk in particular about 2 examples that I've been involved with, the Empower study and the Beer study, both of which are ongoing and use digital platforms in some different ways. So when I talk about clinical trials, I like actually to return to this very early example of what I think of as one of the most pragmatic trials that has happened, which is not exactly a trial, but pretty close by a Dr. James Lind, who was the ship's doctor on a boat in which many of the sailors suffered from scurvy. So this was written in, I believe, 1820 or 1848 that described the experiences that Dr. Lind underwent as part of this excursion. And this is a lot of text, and I don't plan to read through it in any detail. It's a little bit hard to read because the S's are a little funky and look like F's, but so the boat was called the Salisbury, and the excursion was happening in early summer of 1747, and there were a number of patients with scurvy who were sick and suffering. And so one of the things that I liked about this description, he says at the very beginning, their cases were as similar as I could have them, meaning he tried to find patients who had the same level of disease and roughly the same symptoms and so forth, so that he could then assign each one to different therapies to try to understand which therapy might actually be effective. So he put them all together in one place, which was the place for the sick, and they all had the same diet, which doesn't sound too good for those of us living in the modern world: water, gruel sweetened with sugar, mutton broth, and puddings, and then barley, raisins, rice, and currants for dinner. There were then a list of different treatments. So 2 of them were given cider, 2 of them were given something called elixir vitriol, 2 of them had spoonfuls of vinegar. A couple of the worst patients were given seawater, which sounds pretty bad. 2 others had oranges and lemon. And he notes they ate greedily at different times upon an empty stomach. They continued but 6 days under this course, having consumed the quantity that could be spared. 2 others had a paste of different kinds of herbs, garlic, mustard, etc. So he assigned, not randomly, we don't know, he doesn't say anything about how he assigned these, but the statement at the beginning about trying to make them equivalent is very interesting. And then he said the consequence was that the most sudden and visible good effects were perceived from the use of the oranges and lemons. And we now know that scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency, and so citrus being rich in vitamin C is given what we understand now about the disease, makes perfect sense. One of those who had taken them at the end of 6 days fit for duty, and the others who were not completely better, but so much better that they became sort of the caretakers of the others who were still, was appointed nurse to the rest of the sick because he was the best off of all of them. So it's not quite a randomized trial, but I think it's a nice example of something very pragmatic. They're out at sea, they have limited resources. And so Dr. Lind did his best to do a systematic investigation of what might be the effects of various approaches. So I like that example. So to get back to the modern day, there have been a number of features of pragmatic clinical trials that have been identified and that I think there's wide agreement on, if not with respect to every single detail. The first is that we should have a diverse and relatively unselected patient population so that we have limited eligibility criteria, we recruit from a diverse range of settings, and that the barriers to enrollment are low. And this in particular, I think is very important and one feature that I've focused on a lot in my own work. The interventions should be relatively simple and clinically relevant. They shouldn't require a lot of specialized expertise or equipment or facilities to implement. And they should be widely scalable, meaning they can be adopted by a wide range of practitioners and settings. The outcomes should also be simple and easily measured. They shouldn't require specialized processes to obtain. And if possible, they should come from already existing sources, such as the electronic health record or claims information or other information that exists without requiring special effort. And the last feature is more of a consequence than an intention, but it often is the case that we have relatively non-standard randomization structures in the context of pragmatic trials. So because the interventions are designed to be pragmatic, it's often necessary to implement them at the level of a unit rather than an individual. So cluster randomization is very common. We might have randomization at the level of a clinic or a health system or a setting rather than at the level of an individual. And in addition, we tend to see unbalanced randomization ratios as well, because there's often a desire to allow the largest number of individuals or places feasible to assess and try out what the intervention might be. So this definition is now not so recent anymore. It's more than 5 years old. It comes from an article by Califf and Sugarman about ethical and regulatory issues in pragmatic clinical trials. But I find this definition very helpful because I think it hits on the key elements. So the first and probably the most important is that a pragmatic trial is intended to inform decision makers rather than to elucidate a mechanism. And I think this distinction is really critical in understanding along what is admittedly a continuum across from the most explanatory trial to the most pragmatic trial, that the goal in the earlier explanatory phases is to really understand how an intervention works, whether it's a drug or something else, understand the pathways through which it's operating, and to get sort of basic science information about the effects. Whereas when we've progressed to the point of being interested in more pragmatic trials, we're trying to understand what people should do. So we want to inform decision makers. We want to provide information that will let people set policies or standard approaches in a way that is a little more removed from the basic mechanistic concepts and more squarely focused on practical considerations. The second feature is that there is an intent to enroll a population that's relevant to the decision that's being made and is representative of the group for whom that decision is relevant. So this idea of representativeness is really important in pragmatic trials and something that we often miss in more traditional explanatory trials because of the highly selected populations that are enrolled. And then finally, pragmatic trials generally have an intent to either streamline procedures or to measure a broader range of outcomes than might be typically measured. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of pragmatic trials and how some of these features that I've mentioned affect, in particular, the study of behavioral interventions. So I have worked a fair amount in both more traditional drug trials, especially in the realm of oncology, and more recently in more heavily behaviorally focused interventions. And in particular, I have a strong interest in behavioral economics, and I've worked with several groups that have studied different kinds of behavioral economic interventions, whether they be financial or more socially oriented incentive programs. So one of the things that has proven to be really important in this setting is that there's a strong effect of selection in a trial. And this is known, and this is one of the things that is a motivating feature for pragmatic trials in general. Why do we care about broadening the population that we're studying and reducing barriers to enrollment and increasing generalizability? It's because when we have a highly selected population, the effects that we might observe can be different than if we had a less selected population. This is less likely to be a problem in a drug trial because usually we are proposing that there's some biological mechanism of action that might be less affected by patient selection. I have a question mark there because I think it's not, you can imagine scenarios in which there are biologically based features that affect both a drug's mechanism of action and a patient's behavior and or likelihood of joining a trial, but it's a little less clear that those are the case. In behavioral trials, clearly we know that that there are features of participants that affect their likelihood of enrollment that will also potentially strongly affect their response to potential interventions. I've labeled this here motivation. I'm not sure that's the best label, but it's one that is at least a single word that tries to capture the extent of the sort of self-efficacy, involvement, connection that participants might experience that might affect, again, both their likelihood of interest in enrollment as well as their potential response to the intervention. So all this to say that a standard or so-called explanatory clinical trial might provide a very high confidence answer, but potentially to the wrong question, or maybe not the wrong question, but to a question that's a little less relevant than a pragmatic trial might address. All right, I'd like to switch gears a little bit now and talk about some digital platforms that I've had experience with. I think these are proliferating rapidly in the current research environment, which is a great thing. And the more options there are and the more features that these platforms offer, the more flexible we as researchers can be in leveraging them. So clearly we're still in a situation in which our environment is rapidly changing. The technology that we have access to is increasingly bigger and better. Computers are faster, more efficient than ever before, and that's continuing to evolve. Clearly, smartphones and tablets are prevalent, and it's becoming almost a requirement that any trial procedures be also enabled with respect to these other kinds of devices in order to be sort of generalizable and make it possible for participants to really engage fully. And there has been a proliferation of wearable devices, which continues to this day. So Fitbits are one example. There are much more fancy and accurate actigraphy devices that can be used. There are all kinds of home health monitoring systems that are available, from blood pressure assessments to glycometers to all kinds of individual devices that participants with particular medical conditions can take advantage of to monitor their own health and their own status in a much more day-to-day way. Some of these, of course, can be then linked to their providers as well, so that the proliferation of information is really quite substantial. And then in addition, especially in the last year, as a result of COVID, but this was already happening, I think, even before COVID, we've seen changes in healthcare delivery. So there's a much increased availability of virtual care. So I'm sure I'm not the only one who has had virtual health visits of various kinds over the last year. And I think COVID has in some ways shown us that this can be as effective as in-person care, or at least effective for certain aspects, and it's likely to continue even after we've hopefully come through the more urgent phase of the pandemic that it seems that hopefully we're starting to emerge from. In terms of the information that's available, again, this has proliferated and become more and more common and detailed. So electronic health records are becoming essentially standard, and it's very unusual now to be in a setting in which there is not at least some level of electronic capture of health information. This applies to the whole range of health services, from outpatient to inpatient to various kinds of specialty services. We can get information from a variety of other administrative sources. And so insurance claims information is still a very fruitful and hard to wrangle sometimes, but very informative set of data that exists about healthcare utilization and behaviors and cost. There are increasingly registries of information about different kinds of diseases. So there have long been cancer registries. SEER is one such example of a great rich source of data that has captured information on patients with cancer throughout our country. There are other registries of other specialized conditions, and also cooperative groups across the country that focus on particular conditions that have a rich variety of administrative data. And then increasingly, for better or worse, I think there's a lot of information to be had from social media. So there has been a lot of work done involving information from platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and other things that have been used in collaboration or in combination with machine learning and various other kinds of approaches to do things like follow flu epidemics. And the famous example of when Google searches for flu symptoms increase in an area, it's a sign that even before the public health authorities have gathered the data, that flu rates are on the rise in that place. And so there have also been notable examples of this failing. And so there was again a fairly famous Google algorithm that was trying to predict flu that performed beautifully one year and then totally tanked the following year because a lot had changed and the algorithm wasn't able to keep up. So it's fraught with difficulty, I think, but it's also potentially an important area of opportunity that we should keep in mind. There are, of course, associated privacy and other concerns associated with social media, especially when many of us, I think, are not fully aware of the ways in which our activities on social media can be then used by who ultimately own that data, which tend to be the platforms that we're using, and we somewhat blithely tend to sign away or agree to the terms and conditions of use without really knowing what those are. And so that's another kind of ethical issue that it's important to consider. One thing that I think is important to realize is the connection between technology and human behavior and how those two things interact is really critical to the success that we might or might not have when we're trying to engage technology to further research in clinical trials. So it's impossible to scale these activities without the use of technology. But on the other hand, we need to remember that technology is not going to work unless it really engages us and the behaviors that we want to do. So I'm sure we've all had the experience of downloading some new app or some new game and being very engaged with it for like a day and a half and then never using it again because it ends up not sort of fitting into our daily lives or being part of the ways in which we interact with our devices and how all that connects to our day-to-day lives. And so remembering all of that and realizing that the coolest technology needs to be kind of user-centered and user-friendly and really engaging in a long-term way if it's going to be of benefit is just an important consideration. And I think that one that it's easy to lose sight of when we're talking with engineers and trying to develop cool things in a back room. Okay, so in terms of digital platforms, as I said, there are a number of them out there and increasing all the time, and they can do a lot of things. So some digital platforms are designed primarily just to interact with patients and or participants kind of on a day-to-day level, but there are others that are designed specifically for as well for implementation of research studies and potentially of trials. And so a digital platform that's going to be successful in terms of implementing a trial is going to need to incorporate randomization. And again, as I mentioned, likely non-standard randomization approaches. So not simply one-to-one individual randomization, but something more complex. We'll need to incorporate scheduling, whether those are virtual or in-person visits, and tracking of participants, and as well tracking of more trial level activities such as DSMB reporting, safety reporting, other kinds of regulatory issues. Platforms that can link individual devices will be critical because we have a lot of data collection now that's coming from wearables and other kinds of devices. And platforms that can enable different kinds of outreach to participants will be important. I'm involved in a study now in which we're incorporating ecological momentary assessment where patients and participants will be texted every day at 2 or 3 different somewhat random times during the day to get assessments of the pain that they're currently experiencing. This is for a study of knee osteoarthritis. So as a way of understanding the variability in daily experience that these patients have. This can also involve text communications with information, as well as asking for feedback and surveys that can be pushed out to participants. And then the communication can be both patient-facing and provider-facing, and we'll see some examples of both of those in the studies that I'll talk about. There are also platforms that are embedded into the EHR, and Epic is the most commonly used EHR-based platform and has begun to implement some of these research features as well. So often basic randomization is doable, although I've found in my own experience that doing something more than basic randomization can be a little bit challenging within the EHR-based platforms. Participant scheduling and tracking is definitely something that they can do, as well as safety monitoring. Increasingly, there's the ability to link devices, as well as to outreach to participants via text and to request surveys. And finally, there can be both patient and provider facing communication embedded into EHR-based platforms. All right, I'm going to talk now about the two examples that I mentioned. The first is one that I've been working on with a group at the University of Pennsylvania, which is where I was prior to my move to NYU. And then the second is an ongoing project that I'm working on with colleagues at NYU now. So the EMPOWER study, EMPOWER stands for Electronic Monitoring of Patients Offers Ways to Enhance Recovery. We were very proud of this acronym. It took us quite some time to come up with it, but in the end, it worked very nicely. This is a pragmatic randomized trial in patients with congestive heart failure. And the design paper for this trial was published a couple of years ago in Circulation. And this is an example, this is a trial of something that we have termed automatic hovering, which is an intervention that includes a number of different features that is designed to sort of watch over and help maintain focus and care for patients who are at pretty high risk of so-called decompensation or their congestive heart failure disease getting kind of suddenly worse and landing them up in the hospital, requiring more intensive response. So the intervention that EMPOWER has used is to enroll the patients in the intervention group in a daily lottery, which is meant to incentivize them to do a daily weight check, as well as to adhere to their daily diuretics. So patients with congestive heart failure are at risk for difficulties if the fluid levels in their bodies increase too much, because congestive heart failure is essentially buildup of fluid in the lungs and heart, and which then causes difficulty with organ function. And so both of these aspects, adhering to diuretics to make sure that the patients don't retain fluid, as well as weighing in to be aware of their weight, so that if they had a sudden increase in weight, they would be able to somehow address that again before they decompensate and require hospital admission. So the way the lottery works is that the patients are provided with wireless devices. One is a scale and the second is an electronic pill bottle. And they are assigned a number and entered into a daily lottery. If they both step on the scale and open the pill bottle, then they are considered adherent for that day. And we draw a lottery number every day. And if one digit matches, they win a small prize, which I think in this case is $3. And if both digits match, they win a large prize, which I think in this case is $50. I may have those numbers not quite right, but you get a sense of the scale. And then at the end of the quarter, they receive their earnings, and they have a chart that they can follow to see what their adherence has been and how many times they've won. So the lottery provides some entertainment value. It's not, they won't always win if they're adherent, but often enough they will, because the probabilities of winning at least a small prize are fairly high, because only one of the two digits has to match. So it ends up being about 19%. And then every once in a while, if they're fully adherent, every 2 months or so, they would win a large prize. So the variable reinforcement is important. In addition, there's something that's a behavioral economics feature of this, which is called the regret feature, which is that if they would have won because their number came up, but they hadn't been adherent the day before, they'll get a message saying, oh, great, you won, but sorry, you don't get your prize today because you didn't take your pill yesterday. And so that we have found in the past tends to motivate good adherence going forward. In addition, another feature of the intervention, not above and beyond the lottery, is that in this trial, we also incorporated feedback to the providers of these patients if participants did experience substantial weight gain, because that again is the sort of warning sign of decompensation. So if patients, based on their daily weigh-ins, reported an increase of more than 3 pounds in a day or more than 5 pounds over 3 days, we sent via Epic notes to their designated providers, alerting them of the weight change and essentially suggesting that they reach out to the participants. There was no requirement for the providers to do so, but based on some information that we've obtained by interviewing provider participants or providers who were caring for participants in the study, they tended to have pretty robust responses to these alerts and would get in touch with the patients. So it was meant to be sort of a multi-pronged intervention with some direct focus on the patient, of course, to incentivize the activities that we believed would help them maintain a healthy weight and not get in this kind of cycle of decompensation, but also to make sure that the providers were aware of what was going on with the patients on a pretty granular level and give them the opportunity to respond as well. So we used for this trial something called the Way to Health platform, which is a dedicated research platform that was developed by my colleagues, David Ash and Kevin Volpe at Penn, to enable exactly this kind of activity. So it incorporates both the research features, including the randomization and the tracking and the participant scheduling, as well as the interactions with both the patients and providers that was automated through the program. So you can see that the platform is sort of situated there in the middle. It interacted with the patients who are on the left via the wireless devices and the messages about incentives, and as well, we sent some sort of just general tips about reducing salt intake to reduce water overload and things like that. We also then, from Way to Health, pushed out messages about the weight gain alerts through the electronic health record to the providers, with the idea that it would be sort of not a separate system that they would have to go check, but something that would appear to them as part of their regular workflow. And we thought that was important. And then they could reach out to the patients and engage them in addition as needed. So some of the features of the platform that are critical here is that the intervention is delivered electronically. So the engagement of the patients all happened electronically. We did have extra communication by humans when that was triggered by automated data. So either if there was non-adherence for a certain numbers of days in a row, that would trigger a call by one of our research coordinators to be sure that the devices were working and to kind of understand what might be going on with the patients, as well as verification of weight gain when it came in through the electronic scales. We did verify the weight gain before sending the messages to providers, so that we weren't, in case there was, the scales or something was malfunctioning, or somebody, this we realized has happened a lot. Somebody else in the household steps on the scale, and then all bets are off in terms of making sense of the data. So we had to be aware of that problem. So the second feature, and again, one that we think is important, is that the whole intervention is kind of embedded within the health system already. So it's incorporated into the clinical workflow that already exists, where nurses and other providers are following up pretty regularly with these patients. And so they now get these additional alerts. We tried to minimize the burden on the clinicians who are extremely busy and can't really handle a whole separate incoming stream of information, as a way to help them enhance their management, again, within the context of care that already exists. We did use traditional in-person consent in this study. So these patients were initially hospitalized with an episode of CHF, and that's where we ascertained them and obtained their consent. And then they got enrolled with their devices after they were sent home. And our outcomes are measured largely using data from the electronic health record. So we looked at hospitalizations with various diagnosis codes as the reason for hospitalization, and to categorize hospitalizations as due to heart failure or due to some other thing. And we've had some challenges with that, but we thought it was important to evaluate the outcomes using data that could be gathered without going back to the patients themselves for additional questionnaires or other things. I'm going to switch gears now and talk about the second example, which is a little bit different in terms of both the platform and the focus. So this is a trial evaluating behavioral economics in the electronic health record. And it's again a pragmatic trial, in this case in older patients with diabetes. And the design paper of this trial was published in JGIM last year. So the intervention here is quite different. We developed a set of what we call nudges to providers that are embedded within the electronic health record that are designed to enhance both awareness and compliance with stated published expert guidelines on treatment of older patients with diabetes. So some of you may be aware of a program called Choosing Wisely, which is an effort that has engaged a number of different specialty organizations to come up with 10 recommendations per specialty that basically advocate for reducing low value care. And in this case, low value care is defined as care that offers little benefit to the patient and may come with risk and or other kinds of expense. So the item that we chose to focus on here is one of the 10 Choosing Wisely guidelines that the American Geriatrics Association has published, which basically says that older patients with diabetes don't need to have their blood sugar as tightly controlled as younger patients, and that too tight control in older patients comes with some risks, including hypoglycemia and dizziness and potentially falls and other things, and that the risks to older patients of having slightly higher A1C values is not substantial. And so we designed several different versions of this nudge. One is the tailored advisory that you can see on the screen here. And then we had two very similar ones that showed up in different places within the Epic workflow, one in the drug refill section and one in the lab result section. So the primary feature of this nudge is this little caution sign here, which shows an older couple and says, slow down, A1C targets are different for older patients. So we came up with an algorithm that used the age and comorbidities of patients to assess their life expectancy, and then the A1C targets are tailored to life expectancy. So for those with longer life expectancy, the A1C target is 7 to 7.5. For those with medium or lower life expectancy, it's above 7.5. It's 7.5 to 8 and over 8. So this example says this patient has high life expectancy, so the target is 7 to 7.5, and this patient's A1C value is actually 6. So basically, it says back off, slow down. This patient doesn't need to have quite such strong control of their A1C. It mentions some of the problems that tight control can have, and it says consider reducing the current diabetes medication. There's some additional information here that's provided if people want to know how we came up with this life expectancy algorithm, what the Choosing Wisely guidelines actually are. They can jump straight to the orders, the prescription refill place if they want to adjust the medication. And you can't quite see it on the screen here, but there's a place at the bottom that they can acknowledge the alert, and if they want, enter a reason either for agreeing or for disagreeing. It's not required that they acknowledge the alert because we wanted to be careful to make this non-interruptive, because we thought it might just be too irritating for the providers if it was interruptive. Sorry. But again, we tried to use this consistent image in multiple places, so it shows up here in the advisory as well as in the refill protocol and in the lab results section to provide a visual cue for the information about older patients maybe needing a little less control. Two other aspects were not directly incorporated into the EHR, but involved email communication. The first is a set of peer comparison emails that came with the permission of the medical directors of the various clinics from that individual, so that it came from somebody that the providers know. And it basically gives a comparison of how the individual provider is doing, how the practice as a whole is doing, and how NYU practices as a whole are doing. And this example shows that that here the rate of overtreatment is higher for this physician than it is for the practice in general, and than it is for NYU. So this is a so-called negative statement that basically says, you know, you seem to be overtreating your patients. Here are some things you can do to try to be more like the other people in your practice and the institution as a whole. And again, it provides some suggestions for how to handle it, reduce the prescriptions, use metformin only rather than other kinds of things. And again, it's cut off here at the bottom, but there's a few suggestions, and there's a place that they can click to see more detail about this report. We have a corresponding version for a case in which the provider is doing better than some of the comparison groups, that basically has just a affirming and congratulatory email that says, you know, you're in the top group and keep up the good work, kind of thing. And then the last set of nudges is a series of what we called campaign emails, where we actually did a whole design workshop and worked with providers of various kinds to come up with something that would be engaging, and we ended up landing on a game show theme. So this is one example of the Jeopardy themed edition. And these were emails that had animated video components, so that when people opened up the email, there would be this sort of animated thing, and the doctor here would say, I choose, you know, choosing wisely for 300, and then there would be the statement and the answer in the form of the question and so forth for the Jeopardy example. And we had Price is Right and one other game show, and we sort of rotate the different versions, and those get sent out about once a month. So again, the intervention is delivered fully electronically. We're trying to engage with the providers at an opportune moment. So when they're about to see a patient who's over 75, who has diabetes, whose A1C is too tightly controlled according to the Choosing Wisely guidelines, that triggers the communications that I've shown. So that evaluation of patient status happens automatically in the background, and then only appears when it's relevant for a provider who's seeing a particular patient. Again, we try to embed it as much within the existing clinical workflow of the health system as possible to try to minimize the burden on clinicians. So we don't require them to respond, but they're able to respond if they so choose. And again, with the goal of enhancing the management within these existing contexts of care. In this example, we were able to get a waiver of consent for patient participants because they weren't experiencing anything other than their standard interaction with their doctor. And the only thing that was changing was the interface that their doctor was seeing as part of the EPIC system that they look at when they're normally evaluating patients. And so we're pleased by that, because this is an example of really broadening the eligibility, and any patient who meets the very minimal clinical criteria, which is basically that you're over 75 and you have diabetes, is then incorporated into the study. And so we feel that the generalizability here should be quite strong. And again, here, the outcomes are measured using data that's available in the electronic health record. So our primary outcome here is Choosing Wisely compliance status over time, and that's going to be based on the most recent HbA1c lab result that appears in the record. So we're not mandating tests beyond what providers would normally order for their patients with diabetes. And so again, from the standpoint of practicality, we think that that's important. Okay, so let me summarize briefly, and then we can have a little bit of time for questions from all of you, or comments that I'd be very eager to hear. One feature of the use of electronic platforms in pragmatic trials is that the interventions are automated and they're delivered electronically, which provides low or no burden on providers themselves and minimal reliance on research staff. There's some variability in that in the two examples that I gave today. The Empower study did require more work and input of research staff. the behavioral economics in the electronic health record study requires beyond the not trivial setup work to incorporate all of this into Epic, relatively low reliance on research staff once the thing is sort of turned on and launched. The interventions can be embedded within the health system, which is really important to incorporate them into the clinical workflow. We found over and over that when we have extra stuff that we're asking people to do that's not part of their normal workflow, it's very, very challenging for people to sustain, which makes sense because everyone is overburdened and too busy. And so asking them to do additional stuff that doesn't kind of fit in already is really problematic. And so this idea of minimizing burden is really important, whether it's burden on participants or burden on caregivers and providers. And then finally, I think it's important to minimize the extent to which we're asking providers of various kinds to manage information. So the more that we can process and provide the information to them in a way that's accessible and actionable is really critical. If we've had a lot of interactions with providers as parts of focus groups and other things where we can design some beautiful chart that shows a lot of information about a patient, but if we don't accompany that with clear direction about what to do with that information, it becomes not only not that useful, but in some sense almost paralyzing, because I think we can all relate to information overload and choice overload in many settings. I mean, you just have to go to the grocery store and try to buy yogurt to understand how too many choices can make things so much worse. And so recognizing that that's a human experience and trying to address that, especially in the context of providers who are busy and overloaded already with demands and information is really important. And then finally, incorporating information that we already have within the electronic health record or other automated systems to reduce burden on both participants and providers in terms of collecting additional trial specific information is really important. There's a huge potential for innovation in this space. There's a lot of technology that's becoming bigger and better and cooler all the time. And so trying to harness that technology in a way that people can use is a big challenge. There's a lot of detailed information and a lot of immediate information, but again, we have to be careful how we package that because if it's not clearly structured and processed in advance, it's likely to be not that useful. And we need to understand how all of this interfaces with human behavior. And that's one of the areas that I think behavioral economics, which as I mentioned is a strong interest of mine, can contribute to. There's a lot that we now understand about how we as humans process information and make choices and do or don't behave fully rationally in all settings, and understanding that and acknowledging it and incorporating it into the interventions that we choose, I think will in the long run be beneficial. And then just to add that these interventions have to be optimized. So we have to do rigorous testing. We have to understand the needs of different populations, be they providers or participants or payers or other kinds of stakeholders. And we have to incorporate these partners in the design and development of both the interventions and the trials that we use to test these interventions to be sure that we're addressing the needs that come from these various sectors. So I'd like to acknowledge both the Penn Way to Health team that I mentioned, David and Kevin, as well as Laurie Norton, who's been a incredibly valuable program director for the whole set of work at Penn, as well as the really critical EPIC team at NYU that has helped us develop the nudges and incorporate them into our instance of EPIC, and especially Judd Anderman, who's been just a whiz at automating all kinds of things and helping us test out the various features that we're trying to incorporate. And I will stop there. We have, I think, about 10 minutes left, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments from any of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Troxel. That was fantastic. We do have about 8 minutes for questions. There's been some interesting sort of back and forth in the chat. And I wonder if it's like Katie and Russ, if you wanted to sort of pipe in and share what you were thinking around the mechanisms and different mechanisms at play. Or anyone else? Russ can't unmute.
We've enabled it now, sorry.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe Katie should go first because I think she has far more expertise on this than I do. But the general issue that I think was brought up wonderfully is the issue even in drug trials or whatever, the importance maybe of reach and representation and how that can actually involve some potential differences in biological mechanisms also. But again, I'm going to defer to Katie if she's available because she knows a lot more about the specifics than I do. Well, basically, anybody else, please feel free to jump in here too. There was a little line on this, but my notion was, and I hear a lot that these issues are not important because our biology is really very similar, you know, across a whole lot of diverse issues. And I just wanted to bring up 2 points, and the bottom line has to do with interactions. And that is one, that if our selection criteria exclude people or are not successful, and including people that have one or more comorbidities, as trials always do, and or are on any other medications. As we know, many people, particularly older adults are on a huge number of other medications, and that often is the condition that these drugs are used in the real world. But if we restrict this to only studying people that have no comorbidities and no other on no other medications, we really need to be careful, at least I feel, in terms of generalizing the results and what we expect in real world settings.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really important. And I think, I mean, that gets back to one of the primary goals of the pragmatic studies being to really have a broad set of participants allowed and not to be so restrictive with respect to various exclusion criteria. I gave the example of a drug trial in opposition to a behavioral trial because I think it's a lot easier to understand just from a basic behavioral standpoint that the same barriers to participation in trials may also clearly affect responses or ability to engage with different kinds of behavioral interventions. But having said that, I also agree that it's not at all obvious that we are all the same biologically, and that as you say, the presence of other features, whether they be other medications or other comorbidities or even more basic things like social determinants of health, that those are not going to be, the idea that those are irrelevant to the mechanism of action of a drug, I think is fairly naive, actually. And so I think across the board, it's important that we recognize that. And I guess my own experience in the behavioral realm has just made that so clear in that setting that that it's a really important thing to consider. And I wanted to also just comment on, it looks like Fidel's comment about about the stages of trials offering insight into different questions. I completely agree with that. And I mean, it's probably obvious that I'm a proponent of pragmatic trials because I'm here talking to you all and I've done a lot of work in this space. But I also think that it's not as if we can or should replace every explanatory trial with a pragmatic trial. I think there is a trajectory of evidence building that's important, and that often, not always, but often it is important to understand more mechanistic questions and to do something in a more controlled setting to get at that more kind of basic science level of information, which can then help us decide whether or where there should be targeting of a particular approach, and that there's valuable information to be gained from more so-called traditional explanatory trials as well. So I think we need to recognize the appropriateness of various approaches in various settings, and take advantage of what each approach can offer, and think about it as a trajectory rather than as one or the other only being important. I think that's a critical point to make.
So we have a couple minutes left, and we have a question around sort of selection of control groups and the level of evidence required for selection of control groups, and specifically related to this daily management group in the study that you described. Can you talk a little bit about comparison groups?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think especially, again, in the realm of behavioral trials, the choice of what the control condition is not necessarily terribly straightforward. So in the setting of these daily lotteries, which we've used in a number of different areas, ranging from smoking cessation to weight loss to medication adherence in a number of different medical settings, one of the early questions was, well, maybe the patients in the lottery are doing better because they have all this daily interaction with study staff, and somebody calls them on the phone every day I mean, in the early days, not so much now, but in the early days, somebody called them on the phone every day to say, you won the lottery, you didn't win the lottery, whatever, to give them the update. And so this idea of attention control is something that's really important to think about, so that you might, if we're going to be texting patients information about their lottery winnings, we probably need to be texting the other patients at the same frequency, but with something, some sort of, more benign information. So maybe we're texting them, tips on weight loss instead of giving them information about their lottery winnings with respect to their daily weight checks and so forth. But that the social and other kinds of interaction that exists with many of these interventions can be separated from the content of the intervention, in terms of whether it's the lottery itself that is really provoking the good behavior, or whether it's simply the interaction that's occurring. And so we have, it's a really important question, and not a straightforward one most often to answer, but something that definitely needs a lot of thought when designing these kinds of trials.
I often think of comparisons as being, what's a legitimate alternative to what I'm proposing and what I'm testing here? What are the choices that those decision makers are making? How are we going to change the standard of care and usual processes of care? Okay, so I'm getting word that we are done. This has been absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate your time. Thank you everyone for attending. And I hope you join us for the rest of our conference today. We'll be learning a lot about adaptations and complex behavioral interventions. So if that intrigued you in this talk, there's more to come. So thank you, everyone. We will see you in about 15 minutes.
Thank you all so much for your attention. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.